Ch.34 continuing. That same year, 1921, began with Checo Order Number 10, dated January 8th, quote, to intensify the repression of the bourgeoisie, unquote. When the Civil War had ended, repression was not to be reduced but intensified. Voloshin has pictured for us in several of his poems how this worked out in the Crimea. Yeah, I looked some of those up. In the summer of 1921, the State Commission for Famine Relief, including Kuskova, Prokopovich, Kishkin, and others, was arrested. They had tried to combat the unprecedented famine in Russia. The heart of the matter, however, was that theirs were the wrong hands to be offering food and could not be allowed to feed the starving. The chairman of the commission, the dying Korolenko, who was pardoned, called the destruction of the commission, quote, the worst of dirty political tricks, a dirty political trick by the government, unquote. I mixed him up with Korolenko. It's a different guy. He's the leader of a different party, I think, not the prosecutor. In that same year, the practice of arresting students began. For example, the group of Yevgenia Doyorenko in the Timiryazev Academy for the criticism of the system, not in public, merely in conversation among themselves. Such cases, however, were evidently few because the group in question was interrogated by Menshinsky and Yagoda personally. Also in 1921, the arrests of members of all non-Bolshevik parties were expanded and systematized. In fact, all Russia's political parties had been buried, except the victorious one. Oh, do not dig a grave for someone else. And so that the dissolutions of these parties would be irreversible. It was necessary that their members should disintegrate in their physical bodies too. So interesting, says that. You know, like Jordan Peterson says, when you can't kill the idea, so you kill the person who's carrying the idea. It's so true. That's what scares me the most about Marxists. Not one citizen of the former Russian state who had ever joined a party other than the Bolshevik Party could avoid his fate. He was condemned unless, like Maisky or Vyshinsky, he succeeded in making his way across the planks of the wreck to the Bolsheviks. He might not be arrested in the first group. He might live on, depending on how dangerous he was believed to be, until 1922, 32, or even 37. But the lists were kept. His turn would come, and did come. Would and did come. He was arrested, or else politely invited to an interrogation, where he was asked just one question. Had he been a member of such and such from then till then? There were also questions about hostile activity, but the first question decided everything. As is clear to us now, decades later, from there on, his fate might vary. Some were put immediately in one of the famous Tsarist central prisons. Fortunately, all the Tsarist central prisons had been well preserved. And some socialists even ended up in the very same cells and the very same jailers they had before. Others were offered the opportunity to go into exile. Oh, not for long, just 2 or 3 years. And some had it even easier. They were merely given a minus. A certain number of cities were forbidden and told to pick out a new place of residence for themselves. And for the future, would they please be so kind to stay fixed in that one place and await the pleasure of the GPU? This whole operation was stretched out for many years because it was of primary importance that it be stealthy and unnoticed. It's essential to clean out conscientiously socialists of every stripe from Moscow, Petrograd, the ports, the industrial centers, and later on the outlying provinces as well. This was a grandiose, silent game of solitaire, whose rules were totally incomprehensible to its contemporaries, and whose outlines we can appreciate only now. Someone's far-seeing mind, someone's neat hands, planned all of it, without letting one wasted minute go by. They picked up a card which had spent 3 years in one pile and softly placed it on another pile, and the person who had been imprisoned in a central prison was thereby shifted into exile, and a good way off. Someone who had served out a minus sentence was sent into exile too, but out of sight of the rest of the minus category, or else from exile to exile and then back again into central prison. But this time, a different one. Patience, overwhelming patience, was a trait of the person playing out the solitaire, and without any noise, without an outcry, the members of all other parties slipped gradually out of sight, lost all connection with the places and people where they and their revolutionary activities were known, and thus imperceptibly and mercilessly was prepared the annihilation of those who had once raged against the tyranny. Student meetings and had clanked their SARS shackles in pride. In this game of the big solitaire, the majority of the old political prisoners, survivors of hard labor, were destroyed, for it was primarily the SRs and the anarchists, not the social democrats, who had received the harshest sentences from the SARS courts. They in particular had made up the population of the SARS hard labor political prisoners. There was justice in the priorities of destruction, however. In 1920, they were all offered the chance to renounce in writing their parties and party ideologies. Some declined, and they naturally came up for annihilation. Others signed such renunciations, and thereby added a few years to their lifetimes. But their turn too came implacably, and their heads rolled implacably from their shoulders. In the spring of 1922, the Extraordinary Commission for the Struggle Against Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation, the Ch.2, recently renamed the GPU, decided to intervene in church affairs. It was called on to carry out a church revolution to remove the existing leadership and replace it with one which would have only the ear turned to heaven and the other to the Lubyanka, the so-called living church. People seemed to go along with this plan, but without outside help they could not gain control of the church apparatus. For this reason, the Patriarch Tikhon was arrested and 2 resounding trials were held, followed by the execution in Moscow of those who had publicized the Patriarch's appeal, and in Petrograd of the Metropolitan Viennaman, who had attempted to hinder the transfer of the ecclesiastical power to the living church group. Here and there, in the provincial centers and even further down in the administrative districts, metropolitans and bishops were arrested, and as always, in the wake of the big fish followed shoals of smaller fry, archpriests, monks, and deacons. These arrests were not even reported in the press. They also arrested those who refused to swear to support the living church renewal movement. Men of religion were an inevitable part of every annual catch, and their silver locks gleamed in every prison cell, in every prisoner transport en route to the Solovetsky Islands. From the early 20s on, arrests were also made among groups of theosophists, mystics, spiritualists. This book is a tongue twister. Count Palin's group used to keep official transcripts of its communications with the spirit world. Also, religious societies and philosophers of the Berdiaev circle. The so-called Eastern Catholics, followers of Vladimir Solovyev, were arrested and destroyed in passing, and it was the group A.I. Abrikosova, and of course, The ordinary Roman Catholics, Polish Catholic priests, etc., were arrested too as part of the normal course of events. However, the root destruction of religion in the country, which throughout the 20s and 30s was one of the most important goals of the GPU and KVD, could be realized only by mass arrests of the Orthodox believers, monks and nuns whose black habits had been a distinctive feature of old Russian life, were intensively rounded up on every hand, placed under arrest, and sent into exile. They arrested and sentenced active laymen. The circles kept getting bigger as they raked in ordinary believers as well, old people and particularly women, who were the most stubborn believers of all, and who, for many long years to come, would be called nuns in transit prisons and in camps. True, they were supposedly being arrested and tried, not for their actual faith, but for openly declaring their convictions and for bringing up their children in the same spirit. As Tanya Karakovich wrote, You can pray freely, but just so God alone can hear. She received a 10-year sentence for these verses. A person convinced that he possessed spiritual truth was required to conceal it from his own children. In the 20s, the religious education of children was classified as a political crime under Article 5810 of the Code. In other words, counter-revolutionary propaganda. True, one was still permitted to renounce one's religion at trial. It didn't happen often, but nonetheless it did happen. The father would renounce his religion and remain at home to raise the children while the mother went to the Solovetsky Islands. Throughout all those years, women manifested great firmness in their faith. All persons convicted of religious activity received tenors, the longest term then given. In those years, particularly in 1927, in purging the big cities for the pure society that was coming into being, they sent prostitutes to the Solovetsky Islands along with the nuns. Those lovers of a sinful, earthly life were given 3 years sentences under a more lenient article of the Code. The conditions in prisoner transport, in transit prisons, and on the Solovetsky Islands were not a sort to hinder them from plying their merry trade among the administrators and the convoy guards. And 3 years later they would return with laden suitcases to the places they had come from. Religious prisoners, however, were prohibited from ever returning to their children and their home areas. So sad. As early as the 20s, waves appeared that were purely national in character. At first, not very large in proportion to the population of their homelands, especially by Russian yardsticks. Musavists of Azerbaijan, Dashnaks from Armenia, Georgian Mensheviks and Turkmenian Bashmakas, who were resisting the establishment of Soviet power in Central Asia. The first Central Asian Soviets were Russian in makeup by an overwhelming majority, and were therefore seen as outposts of Russian power. In 1926, the Zionist Society of Hereafter was exiled in total, since it had failed to respond to the all-powerful upsurge of internationalism. Among subsequent generations, a picture has evolved of the 20s as some kind of holiday of totally unlimited freedom. In this book, we shall encounter people who viewed their 20s quite differently. The non-party students at this time sought autonomy for higher education institutions, unquote, the right of assembly, and the removal from curriculum of excessive political indoctrination. And rests were the answer. These were intensified during holidays, for example, on May 1st, 1924. In 1925, about 100 Leningrad students were sentenced to 3 years in political detention for reading the Socialistический Вестник, the organ of the Mensheviks abroad, and for studying Plekhanov. In his youth, Plekhanov himself had gotten off far more lightly for speaking out against the government in front of Kazan Cathedral. Keep wanting to call him Plekhanov. In 1925, they had already begun to arrest the first young Trotskyites. Two naive Red Army men, remembering the Russian tradition, began to collect funds for the arrested Trotskyites, and they too were put in political detention. And of course it is obvious that the exploiting classes were not spared. Throughout the 1920s, the hunt continued for former officers who had managed to survive, whites who had not already earned execution during the Civil War. Yeah, so the whites opposed the communists and the reds were pro-communist, something like that. They could have been Cossacks or I don't know. Those who had not already earned execution during the Civil War. White Reds who had fought on both sides, and Tsarist Reds, Tsarist officers who had gone over to the Red Army but had not served in it for the whole period, or who had gaps in their army service records and no documents to account for them. They were truly put through the mill because instead of being sentenced immediately, they too were put through the solitaire game. Endless verifications, limitations of the kind of work they could do, and on where they could live. They were taken into custody, released, and taken into custody again. Only gradually did they proceed to the camps, from which they did not return. However, sending these officers to the archipelago did not end the problem, but only set it in motion. After all, their mothers, wives, and children were still at liberty. With the help of unerring social analysis, it was easy to see what kind of mood they were in after their heads of their households had been arrested, and thus they simply compelled their own arrests too, and one more wave was set rolling. In the 1920s, there was an amnesty for Cossacks who had taken part in the Civil War. Many of them returned from the island of Lemnos in the Kuban, where they were given land. All of them were subsequently arrested. And of course, all former state officials had gone into hiding and were likewise liable to be hunted down. They had hidden well and disguised themselves cleverly, making use of the fact that there was yet no internal passport system, nor any unified system of workbooks in the Republic, and they managed to creep into Soviet institutions. In such cases, slips of the tongue, chance recognitions, and the denunciations of neighbors helped battle intelligence, so to speak. Sometimes sheer accident took a hand. Solely out of love of order, a certain Mulva kept at home a list of all former employees of the provincial judiciary. This was discovered by accident in 1925, and they were all arrested and shot. And so the waves rolled on for, quote, concealment of social origin. Former social origin is received the widest interpretation. They arrested members of the nobility for their social origin. They arrested members of their families. Finally, unable to draw even simple distinctions, they arrested members of the individual nobility, i.e., anybody who had simply graduated from a university. And once they had been arrested, there was no way back. You can't undo what has been done. The sentinel of the revolution never makes a mistake. No, there were a few waves back. The counter waves were thin, sparse, but they did sometimes break through. The first is worthy of mention right here. Among the wives and daughters of the nobility and the officers, there were quite often women of outstanding personal qualities and attractive appearance. Some succeeded in breaking through in a small reverse wave. They were the ones who remembered that life is given to us only once, and that nothing is more precious to us than our own life. They offered their services to the Ch.2 as informers, as colleagues in any capacity whatsoever, and those who were liked were accepted. These were the most fertile of all informers. They helped the GPU a great deal because former people trusted them. Here one can name the last princess, Vyazemskaya, a most prominent post-revolutionary informer, as was her son on the Solovetsky Island, and Concordia Nikolaevna Yossi was evidently a woman of brilliant qualities. Her husband was an officer who had been shot in her presence, and she herself was exiled to the Solovetsky Islands. But she managed to beg her way out and to set up a salon near the big Lubyanka, which the important figures of the establishment loved to frequent. She was not arrested again until 1937, along with her Yugoslav customers. It is strange to recount, but as a result of an absurd tradition, the political Red Cross had been preserved from old Russia. There were 3 branches: the Moscow branch, Peshkova Vinaver, the Kharkov, Sandomierskaya, and the Petrograd. The one in Moscow behaved itself and was not dissolved until 1937, the purge. The one in Petrograd, the old Narodnik, Shevstov, the cripple Gartman, and Kosharovsky, adopted an intolerably impudent stance, mixed into political cases, tried to get support from such former inmates of the Schlüsselburg prison as Novorosky, who had been convicted in the same case as Lenin's brother, Alexander Ulyanov, and helped not only socialists but also KR counter-revolutionaries. In 1926 it was shut down and leaders were sent into exile. I better make note. There's so many things. Counter-revolution. The years go by, and everything that has not been freshly recalled to us is wiped from our memory. In the dim distance, we see the year 1927 as a careless, well-fed year of the still untruncated NEP, New Economic Policy. But in fact, it was tense. It shuddered as a newspaper, as newspaper headlines exploded, and it was considered at the time and portrayed to us then as the threshold of the war for world revolution. The assassination of the Soviet ambassador in Warsaw, which filled whole columns of the papers that June, aroused Mayakovsky to dedicate 4 thunderous verses to the subject. But here's bad luck for you. Poland offered an apology. Voikov's lone assassin was arrested there, and so how and against whom was the poet's appeal to be directed? With cohesion, construction, grit, and repression wring the neck of this gang-run riot. Comment. Who was to be repressed? Whose neck should be wrung? It was then that the so-called Voikov draft began. As always happened, when there were incidents of disturbance or tension, they arrested former people. There's a very good book called Former People, too, about the nobility and the aristocrats who were wiped out during the revolution. I really want to read it, but I can't afford it right now. And it's not in the library. Right? They arrested former people, anarchists, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and also the intelligentsia as such. Indeed, who else was there to arrest in the cities? Not the working class, but the old quote, close to the cadets, unquote, intelligentsia had already been thoroughly shaken up starting in 1919. Had the time not come to shake up that part of the intelligentsia which imagined itself to be progressive? To give the students a once-over? Once again, Mayakovsky came to the rescue. Think about the Komsomol for days and for weeks. Look over your ranks and watch them with care. Are all of them really Komsomols? Are they only pretending to be? Oh, I remember this horrific poem. A convenient world outlook gives rise to a convenient juridical term, social prophylaxis. It was introduced and accepted, and it was immediately understood by all. Lazar Kogan, one of the bosses of the White Sea Canal construction, would in fact soon say, quote, I believe that you personally were not guilty of anything, but as an educated person you have to understand that social prophylaxis was being widely applied, unquote. And when else, in fact, should unreliable fellow travelers, all that shaky intellectual rot, be arrested, if not in the eye of the war for world revolution? When the big war actually began, it would be too late. And so in Moscow, they began the systematic search, block by block. Someone has to be arrested everywhere. The slogan was, quote, we are going to bang our fist on the table so hard that the world will shake with terror, unquote. It was to the Lubyanka, to the Butirki, that the black Marias, the passenger cars, the enclosed trucks, the open hansom cabs kept moving, even by day. There was a jam at the gates, a jam in the courtyard. They didn't have time to unload and register those they'd arrested. And the same situation existed in other cities. In Rostov-on-the-Don, during those days, the flood was so crowded in the cellar of House 33 that the newly arrived Boyko could hardly find a place to sit down. Boyka. A typical example from this wave, several dozen young people got together for some kind of musical evening which had not been authorized ahead of time by the GPU. They listened to music and then drank tea. They got the money for the tea by voluntarily contributing their own kopecks. It was quite clear, of course, that the music was a cover for counter-revolutionary sentiments, and that the money was being collected not for tea, but to assist the dying world bourgeoisie. And they were all arrested and given from 3 to 10 years. Anna Skripnikova getting 5, while Ivan Nikolaevich Vorontsov and the other organizers of the affair who refused to confess were shot. And in that same year, somewhere in Paris, a group of Russian émigré lycée graduates gathered to celebrate the traditional Pushkin holiday. A report of this was published in the papers. It was clearly an intrigue on the part of mortally wounded imperialism, and as a result, all lycée graduates still left in the USSR were arrested, as were the so-called law students, graduates of another such privileged special school of pre-revolutionary Russia. Only the size of Swan, the Solovetsky special purpose camp, limited for the time being the scale of the Boykov draft, but the Gulag Archipelago had already begun its malignant life and would shortly metastasize throughout the whole body of the nation. A new taste had been acquired and a new appetite began to grow. The time had long since arrived to crush the technical intelligentsia, which had come to regard itself as too irreplaceable and had not gotten used to catching instructions on the wing. In other words, we never did trust the engineers, and from the very first years of the revolution, we saw to it that those lackeys and servants of former capitalist bosses were kept in line by healthy suspicion and surveillance by the workers. However, during the Reconstruction period, we did not permit them to work in our industries. while the whole force of the class assault was directed against the rest of the intelligentsia. But the more our own economic leadership matured in VSNK, the Supreme Council of the Economy and God's Plan, that's the 5-year plan, the State Planning Commission, the more the number of plans increased, and the more those plans overlapped and conflicted with one another, the clearer became the old engineers' basic commitment to wrecking. Their insincerity, slyness, and venality. The sentinel of the revolution narrowed its eyes with even greater vigilance, and wherever it directed its narrow gaze, it immediately discovered a nest of wreckers. And take a break there. Thank you for listening.